between Chinese American communities in Southern California and their home villages of those community members in Taishan in southern China, in Guangdong province, China. Her previous field work includes archaeology at the Transnational Historical Site in California. This was one of 10 American concentration camps, as you know, where more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II between 1942 and 1945. Laura has also worked in a variety of field projects in Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Massachusetts, Iceland, and China. She's provided support for a very interesting project hosted at Stanford University called the Chinese Railroad Workers of North America project. Dr. Ng received her BA in anthropology with a minor in ethnic studies from the University of California at San Diego. She earned her master's in historical archaeology here at UMass Boston and her PhD in anthropology last year at Stanford University. She'll be speaking tonight on her research on the Chinatowns of Southern California and in their home villages in Guangdong province in China. Professor Hing.
Thank you so much, Bob. I think I'm gonna share screen.
Yep.
First, thank you to my host at Boston University, Dr. Bob Morachik, and also Dr. Mary Clark for inviting me to present my research, and to all the different sponsoring centers and departments. So my talk today is on research I did for my dissertation at Stanford University. And the title of my talk is Creating Home on Both Sides of the Pacific, the Archaeology of Old Chinatowns and New Villages. And I think this title provides insight into my interest, which is Chinese migration, Chinatowns in the United States, and then also villages in China, which we call home villages. And the twist is that I'm studying Chinatowns that were built in the late 19th century, and then also diasporically connected home villages in China that is new. So that's something that I will talk more about in my presentation, but for now, I want to give some context for why I'm studying using a transnational approach to study these two sites, and why I'm using archaeology to examine the trans-Pacific connections between the home villages of Chinese migrants and then the diasporic sites that they went to in the United States, and specifically, in this case, Southern California. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Chinese American descendants and Chinese descendants that I've worked with for this project, and especially the Gom Benn Village Society, the Gom Benn Scholarship Fund, villagers in Hing Village, where I did my archaeological surface survey, and then in particular, the family of Wong Sam, who lived in the San Bernardino Chinatown, and then the family of Wong Jung, who lived in Riverside, and they've been great with providing oral histories as well as providing family stories, photographs, even artifacts. And some of them are actually on Zoom on this virtual talk, and I just want to give them a shout out. So thank you for being there. And thank you everyone else for being on the Zoom, everyone for coming out tonight. I actually want to provide context for transnational migration by starting with someone whose name is also Wong, but not from the village that I'm studying or the Chinatowns that I studied. So this person's name was Wong Kim Ark, and Wong Kim Ark was someone who was born in America, in San Francisco, Chinatown, actually. And during the Trump era, his name came up because Trump wanted to do away with birthright citizenship. And there was talk of especially taking this away from those with foreign-born parents. And if that were the case, I would be stripped of my birthright citizenship because I have parents who were born in China, actually from the same part of China that Wong Kim Ark came from, called Taishan or Toisan in Cantonese and Hoisan in the local dialect. And the ones that I have been working with also come from Hoisan. So Wong Kim Ark is a name that comes up in terms of birthright citizenship because he helped affirm the fact that we have birthright citizenship. In 1898, when he fought against the fact that he couldn't land in San Francisco when he had made a trip to China. And so he wanted to maintain his rights as a native born person and retain his citizenship status. And Wong Kim Ark, his story is well known today, or fairly well known because of that civil rights case. But I think, and here I in this slide, I talk about the reasons that he fought for this birthright citizenship, because immediately he wanted to re-enter the United States to continue working as a cook. And so this brings in the context, another context, which is that there was an Exclusion Act, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which provided, which barred Chinese migrants from entering the United States if they were intending to work as laborers, and a cook was considered a laborer. And then, of course, he also wanted to stand up for the rights that he had been given as under the 14th Amendment, he did have birthright citizenship. But I think one part of the story that's missing is why is the future-oriented part of his reasoning for wanting to maintain this status that he had. And that was so that he could move back and forth between the US and China in the future. And this is something that Chinese migrants did during his time period and probably his father's time period. And so he's thinking about the future and that he's gonna go back to marry and have children, and he's gonna make multiple visits because that's what a lot of Chinese Americans did. And in this family tree, you see that he actually did go back many times. He had a wife in China, he had 4 sons. And so you can imagine how many times he went back. And so, and his parents too were living in China, had returned. So that's the story that I want to highlight with my research, is this phenomenon that people who were in the Chinese diaspora were thinking about their families that were back in China. And this is why this was so common. And I also want to share what happened to Wong Kim Ark, because oftentimes his story stops at the birthright citizenship case, with him affirming that. And so he actually, in his older age, returned to China and actually died there in his home village, I believe. So transnational Chinese migration is involved a lot of different aspects besides physically getting on a boat and returning to China to visit your family. It also involved sending remittances, which is money, back home, as well as writing letters, keeping in touch with family members. In addition, money was sent back home to build new houses, to construct ancestral halls to venerate the ancestors. And now, more recently, some of these remittance-built structures have been designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And so on the other side of the Pacific, this cultural heritage has been recognized as an important part of China's history. And you can visit these sites as tourist destinations. And on the other side of things, in the US side, a lot of these Chinatowns have not been, they're actually not preserved. And I'll talk more about that in my presentation. But I want to talk about my research questions, which of course focus on transnational migration. And so I'm interested in what impact it had on the daily lives of Chinese migrants and their families. And because so few firsthand accounts of Chinese migrants exist, for example, diaries, for example, letters sent back home, very few of them survived. So archaeology is one of the few ways that we can understand the lives of transnational Chinese migrants. And so how was I going to study the daily lives of transnational migrants? I needed sites that had the strong connection across the Pacific. Unfortunately, I found that these two Chinatowns in Riverside and San Bernardino had already been excavated because of cultural resource management. They were projects that were done because of the law. And so these two Chinatowns in Southern California already had a collection, an archaeological collection that I could revisit and study. And I found out that there's a village in China called Hing, which is in the Gom Benn area of Taishan, that has a strong connection to these two Chinatowns. So I thought that was a perfect, these are three sites that I should study for to answer this question. And here you see the three sites depicted on this PowerPoint. These are some of the sources of data that I used to conduct my research. So again, the archaeological collections, which were in museums in the Southern California area, architecture from both the standing architecture of Porcelain Village, as well as historic photographs of the Chinatowns. I also looked at genealogy books, which were in China, and they go back to the Song Dynasty, when the first ancestor moved from northern China to the Taishan area, to the Gom Benn area. I looked at artifacts, that I collected from a surface survey of Porcelain Village. I conducted oral history interviews, both in the US and China, so with villagers in Porcelain, as well as Chinese American descendants living in the Los Angeles area, and some of them through Zoom because of COVID. I also looked at immigration records from the Chinese exclusion era. So there's a huge bureaucracy that developed to prevent Chinese from fraudulently entering the United States. And so there were many interrogations as soon as someone landed, even before they left to go to China. They would be interviewed to ensure that they had the exempt status to be able to return from China, or that they were US citizens, which allowed them to also be able to land in the United States. So there's a lot of information on families, who's in the family, where they lived in the village, and other personal information. So just to provide a little more historical background, what was causing so many people from China to move to North America, Australia, New Zealand, all over the Pacific. Basically, there was Western imperialism in China, the fact that Hong Kong became a British colony as a result of the Opium War, a lot of inter-ethnic fighting. On the other side of the Pacific in the United States, the gold rush brought the first wave of Chinese migrants to the United States. Subsequently, another wave came because of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was built largely with Chinese labor on the western portion of the Transcontinental. However, once Chinese migrants started coming to the US and they became more visible, there were laws passed to prevent their immigration in the United States. And so the Page Act was one of the first anti-immigrant acts passed in the United States. This was an act that actually targeted Chinese women and assumed that the immigration officials would assume that most Chinese women were prostitutes and so not eligible to land and enter the US. And that's kind of explains the gendered aspect of the Chinese diaspora and migration, which is that most were men who came over. The Chinese Exclusion Act, as I mentioned, prevented laborers from entering. And this was a law that was around for 60 years. So that is why that period of time is called the Chinese Exclusion Era. To provide some geographic context for this study, this is where the two Chinatowns are. They're in Southern California, about 60 miles inland from Los Angeles. And it's in an area that's now called the Inland Empire. This is what the Chinatowns, how they were structured, and about 200 to 300 permanent residents or semi-permanent residents lived in each Chinatown. With the, and they were here because they were seasonal workers for the orange and lemon industry, the citrus industry. They also provided services for the towns of San Bernardino and Riverside. So the Chinese did laundry. They also did they also provided fresh vegetables for the entire town, pretty much. Of course, Chinese merchants provided goods to the Chinese workers that lived in this entire area. So who were some of these Chinese residents? In Riverside, I found two Chinese residents who were vegetable farmers, and one was named Wong Ben, another Wong Jung. Probably started in Riverside in the late 19th century. Then in San Bernardino, Chinatown, there were two merchants that I found linked to this village in China, Hing, Wong Sam and Wong Tong. And so I had a lot of questions about these residents. Were they related to one another? Were they from the same village in China before they had moved to Hing? And so those are some of the questions I wanted to answer. And I'll talk about the answers. But what's also interesting is Chinatown is often depicted as a bachelor society because it was largely male. However, the pictures that just popped up are the sons of each of these men. And they were sponsored as teenagers by their fathers to come to the United States from China. And so they each joined their parents in the Riverside and San Bernardino area. So it's not true that there weren't any families in Chinatown. There were split households, and it's not true that the men in Chinatown were bachelors. So family is what kept kind of the transnational migration and the circulations of people going over time. So to provide some geographic context for this village in China, this is a map of the Pearl River Delta region. And this area encompasses both Guangdong province as well as Hong Kong and Macau, which I didn't picture. But Hong Kong is important again because it's where Chinese migrants embarked and left to go to California and other parts of the Pacific. Within this Pearl River Delta region, which is an agricultural area, and farming is the main occupation. The Four Counties area was where most Chinese migrants in the late 19th, early 20th century immigrated from. There were 4 other counties that also had high levels of outmigration. Within the 4 counties, this map on the left or the right is a blow up of that area. And you can see that Hing Village, which is part of the Gom Benn Village cluster, is the star. And it's in Taishan County, right below the Tong River. And so the river system, the delta system is how they got to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong again to the United States. So zooming in on the Gom Benn Village cluster, there are 13 villages in Gom Benn, and the balloon in red is Hing Village. And Hing is the newest village in this cluster. It's as you can see, it's a agricultural area, but the houses within the villages are densely packed. And overpopulation is one reason migration also occurred. So this new village is across the way from an ancestral hall. And this is where the first Wong ancestor came from. So this Wong ancestor is venerated here in Onghao village. And this is an important piece of the puzzle of why these folks were clustered. These Wongs were clustered in Riverside and San Bernardino. And that's because they all share the same lineage. They all descend from the same person in this part of Taishan. And so the lineage is called the Yanlung lineage, and they're part of the Wong clan. This is their ancestral hall that was reconstructed in 2013. And with that reconstruction and the celebration of their ancestor, they updated their genealogy book, which is on the left. And the genealogy book contains all the information on the male descendants of Yanlung, that apical ancestor. And this is a book that I consulted to answer questions about how people were related to one another in the village. So now I want to zoom in on Hing Village, which I said is a new village. And it was established in 1902 as a planned community. And this is through oral histories. It was built with remittances from people who were abroad. And they could only move there. You could only move there if you came from another village in Gom Benn. And so they didn't move very far, but they were able to provide their families with a new home and show off their success. So with this, and so I visited this village, and there's standing architecture in this village. And so of course I wanted to compare the village buildings with the Chinatown and understand and try to see if the village was influenced by architecture from the 2 Chinatowns. And looking at the historic photographs, my conclusion is no, there was no real influence. from the Chinatown vernacular architecture. The Chinatowns were built in a specific way. They reflected the local architectural styles because there were so many anti-Chinese ordinances that prevented them from building building wooden buildings. And then I think they tried to build in a way that made them not stand out. So racism really structured their building practices in the United States. In China, this village that was built in 1902 and continually developed, as I'll talk about later, their architectural style reflects late 19th century traditions. So this is actually a traditional house pictured on the right, and it's called 3-bay 2-corridor style house made of brick, gray brick, and timber, which you can't see the timber. And so there's no real influence from the Chinatowns. However, I also looked at the shrines, which in both the Riverside Chinatown and Hing Village, there's an earth god shrine from folk religion that is pretty much the same. They're made of brick and granite and in the same shape with the spirit tablet. And so to me, even though the architecture is different, the religious beliefs of the residents, the transnational migrants, was something important to them. So this is an example of something, a diaspora connection that they tried to maintain. So of course, as an archaeologist, I really wanted to understand and look at and compare artifacts from the Chinatowns to the home village, Hing. So I did an archaeological survey of the village and collected artifacts. This is a method used in another project I participated in, the Ng of Grinnell College project in Peck County, the county next door, and it works really well. So with the surface collection, I looked at I collected from the entire village alleyways and from the trash dump, as well as pig pen area. And here's some artifacts that I think speaks to the history of this region in this particular area. So I found a Chert flake, and probably from a British gun flint. And so you might think that this might have come from the United States, brought over by Chinese migrants. However, this is sort of a product that was probably circulating already before Chinese people were immigrating to the United States. And the reason is because there was a lot of violence and banditry in the 4 counties area, and gun flints were used to power guns that were used to fight off these bandits, or used by the bandits themselves. So I thought this was an artifact that told a story without, and this village doesn't have the architecture that defensive watchtowers, which are the UNESCO heritage sites that I mentioned earlier. This metal spoon is another artifact that I found, told a story about the people and what kind of the transnational migrants and what they might have brought from the United States, from the Chinatowns, to the home village. And this is a British manufactured spoon. It has hallmarks on the back of it. And if you know anything about Chinese spoons, they're made of ceramics and they're decorated like blue and white decoration or polychrome overlays. And just to see a metal spoon of British manufacture in the village is interesting, and it made me think of a story that a descendant tells, where he said when his grandfather came back to the village, he really wanted coffee. And so he told his grandson, can you please go to the city and get me some coffee? Like, I really miss it. And so he did. And so I think, this spoon is possibly, possibly a spoon for sugar to put in coffee. And I did find some glass that might have come from a coffee jar, just like this Folgers coffee jar. Another artifact that speaks to the circulation of goods across the Pacific is an American medicine bottle. And the one on the far left of the collection that I found, that includes Chinese medicine bottles from the home village area, probably. And then the one that stands out, of course, is the brown or amber pill bottle. And it looks a lot like the Anacin bottle, which is for pain relief. And so, this is something that we didn't find large quantities of. So this is the only one that we found. So it's probably something brought back again to provide something from the Chinatowns that they had already gotten used to. So of course, I also found a lot of Chinese porcelains in both the home village and in the two Chinatowns. And it was interesting to compare the patterns. I was wondering if I would find the same patterns that we would find in Chinatowns. And the 4 patterns that we often find in the Chinatowns are Winter Green, which is on the left here, 4 Seasons, which is on the right, as well as 2 blue and white patterns one called Bamboo, one called Double Happiness. And so these 2 colorful patterns I found in all 3 sites. And so I think there's, that says something about what is being used in the new village that kind of reflects what's happening in the Chinatowns. But I found one site missing something. And so with the bamboo, and I found that at all 3 sites. In terms of Double Happiness, I didn't find it in the San Bernardino Chinatown. And so this sparks a lot of questions, like what's going on, where this village in China is using a lot of Double Happiness, and then there's a little bit in Riverside Chinatown, and there's none in San Bernardino Chinatown. So that's something that I want to look at more closely. Another interesting difference that I found between the Chinatown sites and home village is the Chinatown sites do not have any peck marks on any of their Asian porcelain or even Euro-American tableware. So peck marks are these characters that are carefully packed with a sharp metal object in the interior of a bowl or dish, and they're ownership marks basically. And they give a household, each household has their own character or symbol. And then when they get together as a village to eat, they'll bring their own bowls to this communal feast, and they'll ensure that they'll get their bowls back because they have their distinctive peck mark on those bowls. So there's a coin on the left, and there's a Chinese character on the right. So with the peck marks, I found that these represent luck, they represent names probably, some of them maybe don't fit in either category, but there was one really interesting peck mark, and it was a cursive W. And so W, I mean, it brought up the last name Wong, and it also brought out this, idea that people were really enculturated in American society, or some kind of Anglo society where they had learned how to write their name in cursive, and then were not, and then instead of writing their Chinese symbol, they would use an alphabet. A letter from the alphabet. And I think this artifact really speaks to how important being a transnational migrant was to those who had returned to the home village. So this W is a new form of the traditional peck mark. And if you're wondering if peck marks go okay, I think I was muted, so now I'm unmuted. Okay, everybody can hear me? Okay. So I think this is a really cool artifact that speaks to transnational migration. So with Hing Village, I also wanted to study the architecture, the standing buildings, and the stories they tell about the people who live there. And what I found out from immigration files is that the village developed over time. So it wasn't inhabited, and even though it's a planned village, it was actually created, built up and expanded over a long period of time. The first part of the village that was built is this area I've blocked out or outlined in blue. And it contains 15 houses. And these date from 1902 to 1914. So the four people that I mentioned earlier who lived in San Bernardino and Riverside, they each had houses in that 1902 to 1914 period of time. One thing you might notice about the houses, they're pretty much identical to one another. I did not, these are not doubles. I did not make a mistake. And so they're the same style, the same architectural style. There's modern houses on the ones on the right, so ignore that. But basically they are 3-bay, 2-corridor. Little differences are the decoration on the roof, that little squiggle you might see, and maybe some have couplets on their granite doorway, some don't. But basically they're the same style. And so there's a lot of uniformity in the early period of the development of this village. And that's important to the people who come from the same lineage. They're all Wongs. They all share this identity as overseas migrants. And not only that, overseas migrants are Chinese migrants who have made it, who've been successful. They can afford to move their families to this new village in China, in their part of the ancestral homeland. Another thing you might notice is that these are wives that I've depicted on the right. And a lot of the pictures come from the Chinese American descendants that I've talked to, and so their stories, I think, get highlighted because of this attention to migration and the home village. And you notice that their last names are all Lee, and they're not related to one another, but all their villages are pretty much 1 mile away or even closer. And none of these women actually got to join their husbands in the United States while they were alive. Actually, these two women that are depicted here actually do end up immigrating to the United States. Or Lee Young did. this woman on the top right. But she was in her 80s by the time she immigrated to the US. So I want to talk about these houses and how they develop over time. And so I mentioned that Wong Sam and his wife lived in this house, or at least he lived there when he visited. And then in the post-1914 era, I learned through oral histories with descendants that he built another house right across the way. And this is a house that if you were to walk down this alleyway, you would see exactly the same thing. And who inhabited this house? Why did he need two houses? And I'll tell you why, because he had two sons. And these are sons that were born in China during his two trips back to China. And when they grew up, they also immigrated to the US. And Wong Genpoi and his wife, he eventually married and had a daughter in the village. And they lived in the house across the way. And then, Wong Genpoi, his brother, younger brother, had a wife. And so when all three men were in the United States in San Bernardino, Chinatown, all of the women were living in this village. And so there are stories that there were from the descendants that there was a hierarchy and that there was some unfair chores of work for Wong Genpoi's wife, or Wong Genpoi's wife. So those are some of the stories that come out of looking at the home village. Going into the 1920s, I also was able to date another house built in 1927. And this house actually belonged to Wang Xunzheng from Riverside, who was a vegetable gardener. And you'll notice this house is quite different than the original house he had built. It's a 3-story mansion. So, and it looks nothing like that 3-bay 2-corridor style house that he had. And so the architectural styles obviously changed in the 20s, and this is reflected in other remittance houses in this part of China. There are Western style architectural elements, such as the balconies, such as the arches above windows, and the materials that were used. For example, the way that you can get multi-level houses is you have to use reinforced steel and concrete. And the house on the left, the original house, was made of brick and timber. So the use of foreign materials and architectural styles is unique to these remittance-built houses from the 1920s and even into the 1930s. And this is the only house in Hing Village that is multi-level that dates to this period of time. And the story is that Wang Xunzheng made a lot of money from a good crop of onions that he kept from the market and stored. And then he cashed in on it. 1927, he said, I'm taking all my money out of the bank and I'm going back to China, building my mansion. I'm gonna live the good life and hang out with my grandchildren. And that's actually what he did. So people, as I mentioned, Chinese migrants were investing heavily in property and not necessarily in other types of consumption. So part of the story, the development of the village is, who's inhabiting these old houses, and Wang Xunzheng's old house is lived in by his son, Wang Quanle. And he eventually gets married and has 3 children. And so they live in the old house, and he's also a transnational migrant. As I mentioned, he came over to the US when he was 15. And again, Wang Xunzheng is living the good life with his wife in the mansion. He ends up running a store, according to his granddaughter, who I interviewed for this project, that he is selling sugar and oil and in the local marketplace. And you might think that this is a story with a happy ending and there's success, but when in talking to his granddaughter, who's also the daughter of Wong Luck, we do see there's separation from Wang Xunzhang's granddaughters and grandson and their own father, Wang Luck. And I'll explain more. So basically, this is part of the legacy of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Wang Luck often spent his time in the United States. Wang Xunzhang lived out the rest of his life in China. He actually died there. His granddaughter, who's depicted here, told me that she herself never was able to immigrate to the United States during this early period of time, the early 20th century. And part of that is the legacy of the Exclusion Act, where very few women immigrated to the United States. And in fact, she did not see her father, Wang Luck, after the Sino-Japanese-American War which started in 1938, until 1970s. So there were decades that went by where she could not immigrate for various reasons, the Cultural Revolution, of course, too. But it wasn't until she herself married a Chinese American that she was able to immigrate to the United States. So the only person that Wang Luck sponsored was his own son. And his daughters did not go to the United States until much later. Another legacy of the Chinese Exclusion is the story of Wang Sam and his wife, Lisa Young. So Wang Sam actually died in 1938 and left he never went back to China. And Lisa Young was living in the village all the way up to the 1960s. And she immigrated to the United States as sort of a refugee from communist China. So family history say that she was actually, he only made 2 trips to visit her. And these were probably trips that were quite long, maybe a year. But the family histories say that she was quite resentful that he did not visit her and could not spend as much time as she would have liked. And so to conclude this this talk, I wanted to reiterate that the development of the home village really depended on the success of Chinese businesses and cooperatives in Chinatown. So these were communities that couldn't have been established or continued on without the other on the other side of the Pacific. And I think that's something that is missing from the story of Chinatowns, as well as this newer interest in the cultural heritage of remittance-built structures in China. I think it's also important to highlight the dynamic facts, the fact that the communities on both sides of the Pacific were dynamic. They weren't static. They changed over time. The village developed and changed over time. The Chinatowns were resilient, and they went through fires, they went through and racist ordinances, and they survived all the way up to the early 20th century, up to the 1940s. So that's a story that I want to tell with the archaeological research that I did. But I also think there's really a lot of potential for future research on transnational Chinese migration. These communities aren't the only ones that are diasporically linked. there's a Liu clan from Suibu in Hoisan, and they're really linked to Rock Springs, Wyoming. And if some of you know your Chinese American history, this was the site of a Chinese massacre in 1885. And this is the memorial. If you look at the names, and I don't think you can see them here, but half the Chinese who were killed in the massacre had the last name Liu. So that's a story, that story of the Liu clan and their history in Rock Springs is something that should be told and looked at from both sides of the Pacific, because actually there are Lius that were still living in Rock Springs up to the 1970s and maybe even today. My own village is called, my dad's village is an Ng village, called Porcelain Village. And there's a connection to Guatemala, which is super interesting. Not my own family history, but because my great-great-grandfather actually was a migrant to Utah, Salt Lake City probably. But the rest of his village, his fellow villagers, they really their diaspora was centered in Guatemala. And with money made in places like Puerto Barrios, which is on the Caribbean side of Guatemala, they built this watchtower, defense watchtower, which is like lit up by fireworks during the Lunar New Year. I think this was taken a few years ago, not by me. I stole this picture, but basically, you know, there's a story there that hasn't been told. The connection between this place in Guatemala, or these places in Guatemala, and this small village in Taishan County. So that's some places and potentials for future research. Also want to connect this talk to the present, because I think there's a genealogy of anti-Chinese exclusion and racism that we still see in the present. So for example, the continued surveillance of racialized communities, and that's where the Chinese Exclusion Act, the whole bureaucracy created with the interrogations comes in. Today's anti-immigrant rhetoric also has roots in the exclusion of Chinese migrants, of what was considered foreign and other, and that was part of the violence in Rock Springs is that anti-immigrant rhetoric. And then lastly, there's been calls for the end of family reunification, which during the Trump era was labeled chain migration, and this is how most Chinese immigrants came to the United States, is by family connections, wanting to reunify with fathers, wanting to reunify with people that, yeah, were part of their family. And so this attack on that type of immigration is something that we should challenge. And I hope that this research is always trying to connect to the present and critique today's immigration policies. So that's my presentation. I want to end with this acknowledgement slide and thank all the archives, all the museums, the family members, descendants, professors, funders for providing support for my research. And thank you all for coming to my talk, all the people online. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. The live audience and our 100 people that are connected by Zoom. Those of you online, if you could enter your questions in the question and answer button, that we'll try to get to it. Okay. Questions? Back here. So we have a couple of an online guest saying, thank you for your well-researched presentation. Another source of archaeological excavation is the book Down by the Station, Los Angeles, Chinatown. You're aware of that? Published by the Coates Institute at UCLA. and they have found peck marks identifying the owner on painted English wares. Making a note.
Yeah, that's a great excavation, and yeah, I consult that book quite often for my research. And yeah, I know there's a peck mark found on Euro-American wares, but I think that was the only one. That was the only peck mark in the whole excavation. So these are pretty rare in Chinatowns in the US. So yeah.
I'm curious whether you would find the same material culture, bidirectional transfer of material culture. Is this just a US thing in the market pressures that are on it in the provision of material culture? Or do you find the same thing happening, say, in Australian Chinatowns coming from other villages in Guangdong?
Yeah, I would love to ask my colleagues in Australia and New Zealand if they have found if they found any similarities with the material culture in Hing Village, or another excavation that I was a part of, Gom Village. So I think someone from Australia has responded.
Paul McGregor, hi Laura, great presentation. Read the American products in the home villages. Did you consider that such projects might have been commercially imported into places like Guangdong City or Hong Kong, and the villages got them via retailers there?
Yeah, sure. That's definitely a possibility. And I think definitely more research in the home villages would help answer that question. But so far we have two villages, Gom Village, Hing Village, to get our information from, and then some of the, yeah, just going to the antique shops and looking around too. So as far as I know, I don't really see that those particular products that I found to be commercially imported, but it's possible that I will revise that that interpretation.
Yeah, Thomas.
Hi, wonderful presentation, very detailed. Just methodologically speaking,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be interesting, that also addresses the question we were just looking at, to compare remittance villages with non-remittance villages, and then see the differences, because then you can really see more about the impact. And then some of the things that you're trying to talk about, how does this affect the society? How does it affect, right, the family? Then you can begin to, tease out a little bit more some of these statements.
Yeah, so the question was about whether I would want it would be great to compare Hing Village, which is a remittance built village, with non-remittance built villages. And I agree that would be good to understand differences and similarities. So right now we have Gom Village is a 600 to 700-year-old village that predates Chinese migration. And so we've done excavations there through the Stanford Wu University partnership. And we kind of were able to see change over time. Didn't really, I think the material culture is a little bit different. There's a lot of similarities with Hing Village, which is the village I studied. But there's some interesting differences, like there's no Four Seasons patterned ceramics at Gom Village, but I find it in all vessel forms in Hing Village. So what's up with that?
You mentioned this Stanford partnership. Juanita Kwok, one of our online participants, asks about whether it was difficult to get permission to organize a cooperative project like this in order to do your archaeological work. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was fortunate to have been a PhD student at Stanford when we did the Gom Village project, excavation and survey. And so there was already a cooperative agreement between the Guangdong Cultural Bureau, Cultural Relics Bureau, which is that's where the archaeologists in China, in Guangdong province are. And so we had a partnership with them and with Wu University in that the local university that is the premier institution for studying the home villages of Chinese migrants. And then the partnership, and then they both partnered with Stanford University, the Archaeology Center, to do research at Gom Benn Village, and then to do the archaeological survey in the village that I studied. So it was, it definitely required a lot of trips to China, translation, translators, and also a conference we did together where we shared and exchanged information. So yeah, it was work, but I think we all ended up trying to coming to agreement that this was a important project, and I don't think I mentioned this, but yeah, these are the first archaeological excavations of a Chinese immigrant home village in Guangdong province.
Laura, we have it, since you have the microphone, we have an interesting question from Magella Hammersley. If you could, can you read the question?
Okay, I'll read it.
And really
Sure.
reply to it.
So Magella asks, it sounds like you investigated a lot of oral history type roots in your research. How significant would you say consultation with descendant communities and cultural communities for places like Chinatowns is? Is increasing these discussions something you think we should try to do more of in the future? Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I have written about regarding the two Chinatowns when they were excavated, there was consultation of with Chinese American descendants for the Riverside Chinatown excavation in the 1980s. But with the San Bernardino Chinatown, there was less of that, and I don't know why, but the Gom Benn Village Society that had worked with the Riverside Chinatown excavation, they weren't like reached out to, and so I think archaeologists who are studying Chinatowns can do better at reaching out to organizations that are really formed by village ties and lineage ties. And some of that might be a lack of knowledge of the local dialect, or those Hoisan dialect, or just not knowing how to ensure those communities. So yeah, I think we need more of that.
Helen?
Hi, I was curious, you mentioned there was like a lack of Peck Marks in the US. Is that, and that the Peck Marks in China were like, because of social, like communal gatherings, were those not taking place in the US because of like outside like racism, or
Yeah.
were they just adapting in the US Chinatowns?
Yeah, so the question was about what the lack of Peck Marks on any tablewares in the United States, or the two Chinatowns I studied. And was it because there were a lack of communal events or feasts? And I think that is part of it, because there's no lineage. I mean, the lineage is centered in China, and they didn't try to recreate ancestral hall in the Chinatowns. They had religious shrines. They had actual temple, but there were no ancestral halls. And so I think that's part of it. They didn't have their families either. The entire family, they had split households. So I do think there's something about that there probably wasn't as many communal feasts in the Chinatowns as there were in China.
Professor Chris Fung from UMass Boston has asked a question. Hi, Chris, long time no see. If you could address the matter of differences in training and differences in approaches of historical archaeologists trained in the US and those trained in China.
Okay, so I think historical archaeology in general is seen differently, because in the United States, we automatically think if a site is 50 years old, it's historic. And in China, the 50 years is like yesterday. So this 100-something-year-old village is not considered, it's not traditionally would be thought of as a archaeological site. And the villagers themselves don't think of the village as an archaeological site. Of course, they live there. But so that's kind of a difference. And we're also studying everyday people. And I think that's a difference that in the United States, historical archaeology is trying to uncover the lives of people who didn't leave behind a lot of documents, who weren't really studied. In China, I think there tends to be a focus on tombs and kings and people who are very important or very old things like the Neolithic. So that's the big differences that I see. But definitely there's more interest growing in the study of everyday lives of crafts, arts and crafts, workshops, and things like that.
Great. Hi, Lauren. Thank you for this really awesome talk. I have a question about the sort of ceramic distributions. In your answer to the previous question, you sort of highlighted the sort of variation in distinct sort of types of these ceramics. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the nature of ceramic production and trade. Are you suggesting, or I guess, is it super centralized, or is it coming out of like big sort of factories?
Yeah.
Or is it more regional? And then depending on the answer, I guess, what, if you had to guess, or just throw something out there, what would you think the absence of, say, the double happiness or Four Seasons or whatever is kind of suggesting? Is it a family connection, a trade connection, a simple taste, aesthetic thing, or what?
Okay, I'll repeat the question. So regarding the ceramic patterns, where are they coming from? Are they commercially mass produced? And yes, they are. they're folklores. A lot of them come from Chinatowns, but they're peasant wear, so they're not like fancy, and they're for everyday people to use. The ones that go to the United States and Australia and New Zealand, I think they are definitely made for export to Chinese communities abroad. And I think that there is a difference in some of the like the double happiness. The ones in the home village, they're like larger and they're a little bit different in their the size of the limbs and the foot ring too. So they are different than the ones in the United States. And so what I think, definitely need to do more research on the quantitative side of things, but the transnational migration network that brought people across the Pacific, that also applied to goods like tablewares, and also applied to things like soy sauce bottles and other objects. So there was definitely an industry there.
Paul McGregor asks online, did the Chinese of the Riverside and San Bernardino Chinatowns, did they work for white citrus growers, or did they own and run their own farms? Yeah, so the whites, they did work for white citrus workers, orchard like ranchers. However, with the vegetable gardens that I mentioned, those were Chinese cooperatives, and they were all like partners, or they hired other Chinese to work to pick the vegetables. And these are interesting because they were on land, leased land, and they weren't owned. So that's something that I want to investigate for my next project, is all these hundreds of acres of Chinese vegetable farms in the San Bernardino Valley that were that provided the fresh vegetables for everyone in the town, basically. Mary Chapman asks online, how did you figure out which houses in the Chinese villages were paid for by specific people?
Yeah, that was my favorite part, because I did a lot of triangulation and looking at immigration files, and because of the interrogations, they were asked who your neighbor is, what row, what alley, like what, where was this person's house. However, the names that they gave were the married names of the Chinese migrants. And they, as you noticed that, or if you didn't notice, a lot of the names like Wong Sam are just nicknames. That's not his married name. So I got the married name from the immigration files, and then kind of, because they're in the Toisan dialect, I just like kind of worked backwards and figured out who was who. So, and then of course with the descendants, who they would go back to China and they knew exactly which houses they had come from. So that was also part of it.
You have all these wonderful photographic portraits of all the people you're talking about. Are those from US Immigration Archives or something? Where are those available?
Yep, those are the immigration from the Chinese Exclusion Act case files, and they have signatures scribbled on them. Those are from immigration officials verifying that they are the person who's being interviewed, and that they probably are trying to prepare to go to China and get permission to come back, to be able to re-enter.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I actually have a comment and a question. First, well, thank you for the presentation, but I just wasn't going to conjecture that there wouldn't be similarities in the architecture because, as you mentioned, the Chinatowns were established during that period of intense racism, and so they didn't want to stay there. And I think when they accumulated enough money to build, to design buildings, they actually tended to build buildings that they thought how Westerners would conceive of Chinese buildings. So that the most prominent building in Boston, Chinatown, the Chinese merchant building, is built in that manner. It's not actually how Chinese architecture is, but how they think a lot of society conceives of Chinese architecture. So I just wanted to put that. But my question was that one of the things I know like that in the Chinatown did was that sometimes they had to, the association had to be responsible for sending remains back to China, to be buried in China. So that would be a, one way that connects the villages to the Chinatown. So I was wondering if you had explored that aspect of that.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for coming to the presentation. Long time no see, and also for your question. So I'll repeat it. The comment was the Chinese Merchants Building in Boston, Chinatown, is built in a way that is what Chinese people thought white people would think Chinese architecture would look like. And so there's a support for why Chinese migrants never really built like really Chinese looking buildings. So the question was what I knew about bone repatriation. So basically sending bones of deceased Chinese migrants back to China. And yes, they did that in the San Bernardino, Riverside, Chinatown areas. Interestingly, because so many of the Chinese migrants died right before the Sino-Japanese War or the Communist Revolution, their bones remained in the cemeteries in Riverside and San Bernardino. And that's why I was able to study the grave markers of many of the Chinese migrants that I talk about. And this has important information like their married name, their generation name, the village that they come from, and those are the most important things. So that's how I triangulate that information with the genealogy book that I got. And so I'm looking up these people using their grave marker names or names that descendants gave me, and then seeing, are they related to one another? And I forgot to answer that question. The answer is no, they're not related to one another. These are people that they share this identity as migrants who went abroad, made money, And the lineage is, you know, they share the same lineage, but they're not uncles, they're not cousins, they're not grandfathers and grandsons. They're really just kind of distantly related to one another.
We have an interesting question from Buck Wong online. I'm glad to see your ending remarks about how understanding the 19th and early 20th century experience relates to current social and political issues. To what extent is your research motivated by the present political situation? Or was this on your mind when you started your study and investigation a number of years ago?
Yeah, I think my interest in Chinese American historical archaeology and now what we call Chinese diaspora archaeology is very political, because I didn't learn any of this stuff as a child. Even though I grew up in California, I didn't learn about the 1885 Rock Springs massacre of Chinese. I think I did learn about the Exclusion Act, and actually Buck Wong, who's asking the question, is my high school history teacher. So props to him for sharing the 1882 exclusion law. I know he would say that was a year he will never forget, and I also haven't because of that. And so this is all these stories of Chinese being people who moved back and forth. I think it's definitely a part of, and people who were discriminated against. That part of the story of Chinese migration really influenced my wanting to understand their lives, their everyday lives, and to try to understand my own heritage too, of course, and my parents being immigrants, as well as this great-great-grandfather that I had who died in Utah, and what was his life like, since I don't know anything about it. So yeah, but definitely that trying to connect to the present is something that I always try to do.
Professor Paul Watanabe from UMass Boston asks, did the return migrants have any discernible influence on the social, political, etc. lives of the new Chinatowns that might reflect some influence from their experience in the US?
Okay, let me see if I can see that question. Oh, it's right there. Okay, so I think the return migrants have any influence on
I think on their home villages,
on
on
the
the social aspect of.
Oh, okay,
their
yeah.
villages when they return.
So I think definitely there are stories of people just, you know, returning in different clothing than they left with. Of course, Western style clothing, with suitcases full of probably foreign goods and like candies, cookies, things like that. And also, I think I would argue they probably brought practices that they had gotten used to in the US, and maybe they continued them in China. I know I read a story, or there were researchers who went to Taishan, actually from UCLA in the 1980s, after China opened up to the world, and they said that there was some kind of soap that people really loved getting from overseas Chinese migrants who returned. So yeah, there's definitely stories like that.
Paul McGregor asks about a particular feature. Are there any communal pig roasting ovens found in Wong Village or in the California Chinatown? Very many of these across Australian Chinese diaspora archaeology are found.
Okay, yeah, in San Bernardino Chinatown, for sure. There were pig roasting ovens there that the archaeologists uncovered. And then also like, you know, I think there wasn't really much found next to the big ovens, but yes, for that. Riverside Chinatown, no, but there definitely were butchers there. And in Wong Village, no, I didn't find any pig roasting ovens.
Oh, so many questions coming
I
in.
know.
Have any questions from the live audience? We'll pick just a few more. We've already just about reached the end of our time here. Kay Ueda at Stanford. It says a wonderful presentation. Going back and forth between the US and their homeland is a common practice among new immigrants. Did American-born second generation also go back to China? Did they acquire Chinese nationality as well? How do they construct their citizenship identity?
Oh, great question. I would love to know that too. No, so first part, yes, there were Chinese American US born citizens, just like Wong Kim Ark. So Wang Jung, the guy with the mansion, he was born in the United States. Also Wong Benn, born in the United States. Both of them built houses in China. Wang Jung, as I mentioned, died in China. And he actually never told his children or grandchildren that he was born in the US. They all assumed he was born in China. So that was super interesting. And so to me, it kind of harkens to that fact that they might have had birthright citizenship, but they didn't have social citizenship. They weren't included in the fabric of America. And so to me, they didn't really care. Like being American was probably not something that we come to appreciate today. So I think China was something that they looked to as part of their future.
We have a lot of interest in the material culture. Terry Darcy asks, could the lack of peck marks in America be because peck marks were put on the dishes by the women of the family, and most of the women were back in China?
Great question. I would think a lot of the peck marks were probably done by the heads of the households, actually. But it's like a lot of women were illiterate. So it's kind of interesting that, to think about gender and who was putting these peck marks on there.
Kathy, yeah.
What seaport did these immigrants come back into China, and how close it is to Canton?
Yeah, so they would probably.
Canton is-
Oh, so what seaport did they
Did they land?
land on when they returned to China?
And that my question
Yeah.
is that within China, Canton is the biggest trading
Yeah.
port in China. And talking about Western goods, I was thinking about the balcony
Yes.
as an architecture from the West. It could be also from Cantonese influence and goods coming in. So I think
Yeah.
that the comparing the villages that has this diaspora and versus not will be very interesting if Western goods and Western architecture is found in these villages as well. I think that
Yeah.
I think one cannot underestimate the huge impact of Canton.
Yeah, I think that, so the question was about, does Canton, which is called Guangzhou now, impact the Western influences we see in the architecture, for example, the Western style balconies and maybe other products, Western products. And I think it's possible. I'm not an architectural historian, but the architectural historians, I think, note that some of these styles come from postcards that they've seen, possibly buildings they saw in Hong Kong, possibly foreign buildings they saw in Guangzhou. So I think you're right. There's definitely a lot of influence. And I think, again, more research needs to be done in the home village, more artifacts need to be collected, studied to understand what types of products are already in the home, like what Western goods are already there and what's being circulated by Chinese migrants.
And what port did they come in?
Oh, the port, sorry, I forgot. She also asked, the audience member also asked about what seaport they landed in. I think from Hong Kong, they would take a smaller boat to Jiangmen. And then from Jiangmen, they would take smaller boats to their villages.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
So you said a lot of the Chinese immigrants were working to provide for their families back in the home village.
Yeah.
How did they bring their currency back to
Yeah.
China? What was considered valuable in the home village?
Currency was Mexican silver, I believe, and basically there was an industry that served to exchange money, and these were called gold mountain firms, because the United States, Canada, Australia, they were each called Gold Mountain at some point, and then these gold mountain firms basically were also tied to people's lineage or geographic villages. And so there was a lot of trust, and they would help exchange money for migrants trying to give remittances to their family members. So that's how they did that.
Great. Well, I think we will wrap up there. Thank you very much, Laura, for this interesting talk and your stamina in answering lots of really interesting questions. I urge everybody to please look at the vu.edu/archaeology and vu.edu/Asian websites for our upcoming lectures. We have lots more lectures coming this spring. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to the webinar participants for logging on. Thank you.
Thank you.